Canada has just made a bold move in the steel trade arena, dramatically altering the landscape of North American commerce. By taking a firm stance on its steel industry, Ottawa has locked down its resources, prioritizing domestic consumption over exports. This decision has sent shockwaves through the industry, especially across the border in the United States, where Detroit's automotive sector is bracing for higher costs and potential disruptions in production. The move comes in response to the 30% tariffs imposed by President Donald Trump's administration on steel and aluminum imports. While these tariffs were intended to protect U.S. industries, Canada has turned the tables by announcing that it will limit the amount of steel it exports to the U.S., redirecting it instead to domestic use. The move effectively creates a new barrier, one that's not enforced at the border, but at the heart of the steel production line itself. The decision to prioritize domestic demand marks a significant shift for Canada, which has historically been one of the largest suppliers of steel to the U.S. In 2022, Canadian steel producers sent 5.5 million tons of steel to the U.S., generating a hefty $7.3 billion in revenue. However, with the introduction of the U.S. tariffs, these exports were no longer financially viable. Ottawa has instead chosen to cater to domestic markets, where demand for steel is on the rise due to infrastructure investments, energy projects, and green energy initiatives. One notable example of this is the federal government's push for domestic content in green energy projects. As part of its climate strategy, Ottawa is mandating that 60% of the components used in wind turbine construction be sourced domestically. Additionally, projects like hydrogen plants in the western provinces and pipeline expansions in Alberta will require significant quantities of steel, all of which will now be sourced from within Canada. The shift has provided a significant boost to Canadian steelworkers, many of whom were previously laid off or faced reduced hours due to the uncertainty of the U.S. market. The United Steelworkers Union has praised Ottawa's decision, which has effectively shielded workers from the fallout of the U.S. tariffs. In fact, many Canadian steel plants, particularly in Hamilton, Ontario, are now operating at full capacity. Local factory managers are even posting job openings as production ramps up to meet the surge in demand for domestically sourced steel. But what about the U.S.? Detroit's automotive sector, which relies heavily on Canadian steel, is facing a grim reality. With a 30% tariff now placed on steel imports, the cost of raw materials for U.S. manufacturers has risen significantly. This price increase is expected to raise production costs by as much as $1,800 for some vehicle models, such as the Ford Bronco. If these costs are passed on to consumers, the automotive market could see a decline in sales, which in turn could lead to job cuts in Michigan. The Trump administration's protectionist stance, intended to bolster American steelworkers, may inadvertently hurt the very workers it was designed to protect. This shift in the balance of steel trade presents a unique dilemma for the U.S. automotive lobby. While the U.S. steel lobby may applaud the protectionist tariffs, the automotive sector is now feeling the heat. The increase in steel prices could make American-made vehicles less competitive in the global market, potentially leading to a loss of market share. Moreover, with steel now prioritized for Canadian consumption, Detroit may find itself competing for a shrinking supply of steel, further driving up prices. Canada's new approach is rooted in more than just economics. It's also a response to the environmental challenges of steel production. The country's steel sector accounts for 7% of its carbon emissions, and Ottawa's focus on clean energy and carbon neutrality has prompted a shift toward electric arc furnaces, which are significantly more environmentally friendly than traditional blast furnaces. Federal grants are helping to accelerate this transition, and the emphasis on green steel is helping Canada position itself as a leader in the global push for sustainable industrial practices. While Canada's decision has sparked significant debate, it's clear that the move is strategically timed. Ottawa is capitalizing on the U.S. protectionist policies to secure its own domestic market and to lay the groundwork for a future in which Canada's steel sector is less reliant on the volatile U.S. market. But the move has not been without its critics, particularly in Washington, where lawmakers are accusing Canada of unfairly restricting trade. Stay tuned as we continue to explore the political and economic implications of Canada's steel strategy in Part 2. If you haven't already, subscribe to our channel for more updates and join the conversation in the comments below. As Canada's decision to limit steel exports to the U.S. continues to reverberate through North American markets, the economic consequences are becoming more apparent. Ottawa's strategy has not only reshaped the local steel industry, but has triggered a chain reaction, sending shockwaves across the border. The shift is particularly evident in the U.S. automotive sector, which now faces the twin challenges of higher production costs and supply shortages, while steel consumers in Canada are reaping the benefits of more accessible and affordable resources. The heart of this new arrangement lies in Ottawa's decision to prioritize Canadian domestic needs. While it is true that Canada remains a major supplier of steel to the U.S., the federal government has now deemed it more advantageous to keep steel for domestic infrastructure and energy projects. And these are not small projects. Canada's green energy push, particularly its focus on wind and hydrogen projects, requires vast quantities of steel. As part of the country's climate strategy, Ottawa has mandated that a significant portion of the steel used in such projects be sourced domestically. In this way, Canadian steel is being funneled directly into critical national infrastructure, giving a boost to jobs and growth within the country. In terms of job security, the decision has been a godsend for Canadian steelworkers, who had previously suffered due to the uncertainty surrounding U.S. tariffs. As the market for Canadian steel in the U.S. dwindled, many steel plants were forced to scale back operations. However, with Ottawa's new policy, local workers are back at work, with some factories operating at full capacity. The Canadian government has even allocated a portion of its budget to support clean energy projects in steel plants, which will help lower emissions while simultaneously creating jobs and spurring innovation. This shift in focus has also encouraged investment in Canadian steel production. To meet rising demand, many steel plants are embracing more efficient, environmentally friendly methods of production, particularly electric arc furnaces, which are expected to cut emissions by half compared to traditional blast furnaces. This move towards cleaner steel production aligns with Canada's broader climate goals of reducing carbon emissions by 40% by 2030 and achieving net zero emissions by 2050. But the real tension arises from the fallout south of the border. Detroit, the engine of the U.S. automotive industry, is now grappling with the financial repercussions of Canada's steel policies. American automakers, who have long depended on affordable steel from Canada, are now confronted with a 30% tariff on imports, raising the cost of raw materials and threatening to increase production costs for a range of vehicles. In particular, U.S. automakers who rely heavily on pickup truck production are at risk of price hikes that could make their vehicles less competitive in the marketplace. For example, one Wall Street analyst recently predicted that the price of the Ford Bronco could rise by as much as $1,800 due to the new tariff. This could be a major blow to the U.S. auto sector, where price sensitivity is already high and sales have begun to slow. The ramifications of these higher production costs are not limited to Detroit alone. As manufacturers struggle with higher material costs, the entire automotive supply chain could be affected, leading to a potential slowdown in production and ultimately a reduction in jobs. For example, the ripple effect could lead to a reduction in work shifts at parts suppliers across Michigan, who may face lower orders due to decreased consumer demand for more expensive vehicles. This is exactly the opposite of what President Trump had hoped to achieve with his steel tariffs, which were originally designed to protect American jobs. But with Canada turning the tables and keeping its steel for domestic use, Trump's protectionist agenda is being undermined. In Washington, the political fallout is also taking shape. Lawmakers from states that are heavily dependent on steel imports from Canada are already sounding the alarm. Members of Congress, particularly those representing Great Lakes states like Michigan and Ohio, have voiced concern over the economic impact of higher steel prices. Some have even accused Canada of creating a de facto trade barrier, diverting valuable steel away from the U.S. market and causing economic harm. However, this accusation may be more symbolic than substantive, as Canada's actions are in line with international trade norms. Ottawa is not providing any tax subsidies or direct financial aid to its steel producers. It is simply directing its domestic steel supply to domestic consumers first, followed by export sales. This distinction has led trade experts to suggest that Canada's move is not necessarily protectionist, but rather a well-considered adjustment to shifting market realities. On the other hand, the U.S. steel lobby could seize upon this situation to argue that Canada is benefiting from state-supported domestic production, which may not be entirely fair to U.S. producers. But the Canadian approach has already passed muster with international trade regulators, who have largely deemed it to be within the boundaries of acceptable trade practice. As Ottawa's decision to prioritize domestic demand unfolds, The Canadian government is betting that its economic strategy will create a more sustainable and resilient steel industry, even as it faces the pressure of reduced exports to the U.S. The political landscape in Washington is set to become even more contentious as these developments unfold. Already, members of Congress have begun to accuse Canada of undermining U.S. industry by keeping steel at home and only allowing limited exports to other countries. These political tensions are likely to escalate, as U.S. lawmakers are forced to weigh the potential economic damage to American automakers against the pressure from steel manufacturers who argue for a more competitive domestic steel industry. Canada's decision, however, is not just about protecting steelworkers or insulating its economy from the effects of U.S. tariffs. It is also a direct response to the broader issue of global supply chains. During the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, the fragility of these supply chains became painfully apparent. With trade routes closed, manufacturing halting, and logistics snarled, countries like Canada learned an important lesson. Having a more self-sufficient supply chain is not only a matter of economic security, but also of national resilience. In this context, the new focus on domestic steel production makes sense. Canada is not just keeping steel at home for economic reasons, but also for strategic security. As the situation continues to develop, Canada's steel strategy could have far-reaching consequences. While some in the U.S. will undoubtedly view it as a direct challenge to American jobs and industry, others may begin to see the benefits of a more sustainable and localized steel supply chain. Canada, for its part, will continue to monitor the evolving situation, looking for ways to maintain a balance between its domestic needs and its international trade obligations. With all of this in mind, the unfolding trade battle between Canada and the U.S. is not just about steel tariffs. It is a broader reflection of the shifting dynamics of North American trade and the increasing importance of domestic production in the face of global disruptions. As the political, economic, and environmental stakes rise, it remains to be seen how this conflict will play out in the months and years to come. As we look towards the future, Canada's decision to prioritize domestic steel production amid rising U.S. tariffs has set the stage for a series of important developments in North American trade relations. While Ottawa's actions have reshaped its steel industry and significantly altered the dynamics between the two countries, the long-term impacts will depend on several key factors, including economic stability, political reactions, and the broader global market for steel and carbon emissions. One crucial consideration is how the domestic steel market in Canada will evolve. With the U.S. tariffs in place, Canadian steelmakers have found themselves in a position where their primary market, the United States, has become much less lucrative. However, by shifting focus to domestic consumption, Canada is creating a stable market for its steel producers. The increase in government infrastructure investments, such as funding for green energy projects and hydrogen plants, has created a surge in demand for locally produced steel. Moreover, the domestic demand for steel in Canada is projected to grow by an additional 1 million tons by 2026, further boosting local production. This shift in focus is not just about fulfilling national demand, but also positioning Canada as a leader in the global push for greener industries. By prioritizing sustainable steel production, including the use of electric arc furnaces and supporting carbon neutrality projects in steel plants, Canada is aligning its steel industry with its ambitious climate targets. The federal government's allocation of 1.2 billion Canadian dollars to fund carbon-neutral steel initiatives is expected to bring long-term benefits, both in terms of environmental impact and economic growth. But while Canada has found a way to safeguard its steel industry domestically, the U.S. is still grappling with the fallout of its own protectionist measures. The automotive sector in particular stands to lose the most from the rise in steel prices caused by the Canadian shift. U.S. manufacturers will now face higher material costs, which could lead to higher prices for American-made vehicles, particularly pickups, already a high-cost segment. If the price hikes lead to reduced consumer demand, the number of shifts in automotive factories may decrease, putting jobs at risk. This situation, which undermines the core goal of Trump's protectionist tariffs, preserving American jobs, raises the question of whether the tariffs have ultimately succeeded in their purpose. Despite the challenges posed by Canada's domestic steel strategy, the U.S. is not without options. The Trump administration's focus on protectionism was designed to foster a competitive domestic industry, but it has backfired in certain sectors. In particular, the U.S. auto industry now finds itself facing rising costs that may erode the competitive advantage it once held. For U.S. policymakers, this represents a significant dilemma. Do they continue to support tariffs at the expense of higher consumer prices and potential job losses? Or do they reconsider their approach to trade and work with Canada to ensure a fairer, more balanced trading environment? The political fallout in Washington, too, is likely to continue. As Canadian steel manufacturers enjoy a new wave of domestic demand, U.S. lawmakers, especially those in steel-dependent states, are raising concerns. Accusations that Canada is engaging in unfair trade practices by keeping its steel at home are gaining traction in the media and in Congress. However, legal experts argue that Ottawa's actions are not inherently protectionist because no direct subsidies are being provided to Canadian producers, only a guarantee of a domestic market for their products. This debate also has a broader geopolitical context. As the global steel market becomes increasingly competitive, countries like Canada are looking for ways to secure their own supply chains while mitigating the environmental impact of steel production. Canada's emphasis on green steel and the gradual shift towards cleaner production methods could make it a key player in the global steel market, particularly as European nations impose higher carbon tariffs on foreign goods. By positioning itself as a supplier of low-carbon steel, Canada is not just navigating trade tensions with the U.S., but also preparing to compete in an emerging market for sustainable industrial products. At the same time, Canada's steel strategy also underscores a larger trend in global trade: the move toward localization. As supply chains become more fragile and unpredictable, particularly in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, countries are increasingly looking to shorten their supply chains and reduce dependence on foreign suppliers. For Canada, this means ensuring that its steel industry is resilient enough to meet domestic needs, and that it can weather future disruptions in global trade. By focusing on local production and minimizing reliance on external markets, Ottawa is positioning itself as a more self-sufficient nation in an uncertain world. Looking ahead, the balance of power in North American steel trade could shift dramatically. While the U.S. remains a dominant force in the global economy, Canada's proactive approach to steel production and sustainability could provide it with new leverage in both economic and diplomatic negotiations. Already, the Canadian government is eyeing opportunities to expand its exports to other markets, particularly in Europe, where the demand for low-carbon steel is on the rise. By offering a green steel option, Canada could create a niche for itself in the global market, while simultaneously strengthening its domestic industries. As the situation continues to unfold, there are several critical questions that remain unanswered. Will the U.S. reconsider its tariffs in light of the growing costs to its own industries? Will Canada's green steel strategy succeed in attracting new customers abroad, or will domestic consumption continue to dominate the market? And perhaps most importantly, will Canada's gamble on a more self-sufficient steel industry pay off in the long term, or will rising costs and supply chain challenges undermine its efforts? Only time will tell. For now, Canada's steel industry stands at a crossroads, facing both unprecedented opportunities and significant challenges. As the global steel market evolves and the pressures of environmental sustainability and economic competitiveness intensify, Canada is positioning itself to be a key player in the future of North American and global trade. But whether it can navigate the complexities of this new trade landscape will depend on its ability to balance the demands of domestic production with its obligations to international markets, all while managing the political fallout from its neighbors to the south.